You think because you use big words, you're untouchable? Officer Nolan sneered, the heavy, electric clippers vibrating violently in his massive hand. He slammed her against the brick wall. Out here in the dark, you're just another piece of trash. The cold steel blades bit deep into her scalp, severing her thick, beautiful locks. They hit the pavement like dead snakes. Are you finished? She asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, carved from absolute ice. 3 minutes later, he'd realize he just shaved the head of the Honorable Renata Vexley. The suffocating humidity of a late August heatwave clung to the city long after the sun had set. The neon sign of the 2-4-hour pharmacy on the corner of 8th and Elm flickered violently, its erratic buzzing the only sound cutting through the oppressive, midnight silence. This was a neighborhood caught in the violent, messy throes of gentrification, a place where luxury high-rises cast long, sharp shadows over decaying, decades-old brick storefronts. Honorable Renata Vexley pushed open the heavy glass door of the pharmacy, the bell chiming weakly above her. She stepped out into the muggy night air, a small, nondescript brown paper bag clutched securely in her left hand. To anyone passing by, she looked entirely unremarkable, perhaps even vulnerable. Exhausted after a grueling, 14-hour marathon session presiding over a labyrinthine federal racketeering trial, Renata had shed the armor of her courtroom. She wore a pair of soft, loose-fitting gray sweatpants, a simple black hoodie pulled up against the night chill, and pristine white sneakers. Her most distinguishing feature, a glorious, waist-length crown of thick, meticulously cultivated locks, was safely tucked away beneath a wide, emerald green silk sleep bonnet. She had dismissed her federal security detail, a highly capable woman named Monica, over an hour ago. Renata had simply wanted to walk the 3 blocks from her heavily secured townhouse to pick up her husband Rowan's blood pressure medication. She craved the anonymity of the dark, the rare luxury of existing in a space where no one was demanding a ruling, an objection, or her life. She paused under the flickering street lamp to adjust her grip on the paper bag. It contained the medication, yes, but nestled beneath the pill bottles was something infinitely more dangerous, a sealed, encrypted flash drive handed off to her by Breyer, her most trusted court clerk. The drive contained the final, damning financial ledgers needed to sign a massive, multi-agency sweep warrant at dawn. Suddenly, the night shattered. The roar of an accelerating V8 engine tore through the empty street. A police cruiser, its headlights off to mask its approach, rounded the corner with a violent screech of rubber. It jumped the curb slightly, stabilizing before rocketing toward Renata. 10 feet away, the blinding, high-intensity halogen spotlights flipped on, pinning her against the brick wall of the pharmacy like an insect under a microscope. Renata did not flinch. She simply raised her right hand to shield her eyes from the blinding glare. The calculated stoicism that made her a terror on the federal bench locked into place instantly. The cruiser's doors burst open before the vehicle had even completely stopped. Out stepped Officer Nolan. He was a mountain of a man, his uniform stretched tight across a barrel chest, his neck thick and red. He moved with the aggressive, hyperkinetic swagger of a predator who had spent too many years facing zero consequences. From the passenger side emerged Officer Spencer, a younger, much thinner man whose eyes darted nervously, reflecting the spinning red and blue lights that now bathed the alleyway in a chaotic strobe. Hands out of your pockets. Now. Do it now. Nolan roared, his voice echoing off the concrete, his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his unholstered sidearm. Renata calmly lowered her hand from her eyes. She did not raise them in surrender, nor did she make any sudden movements. She stood perfectly still, her posture impeccably straight despite the casual clothing. Officer, there is no need to shout. I am simply walking home from the pharmacy. I didn't ask for a life story. I said, get your hands where I can see them. Nolan closed the distance in 3 long strides. The smell of stale coffee, spearmint gum, and pure, unfiltered adrenaline rolled off him. His eyes scanned her, the hoodie, the sweatpants, the silk bonnet, the dark skin. In Nolan's severely prejudiced, power-hungry mind, the visual calculus was already complete. She was a target. She belonged to the streets he believed he owned. My left hand is visible and holding a paper bag containing medication, Renata stated, her voice a low, melodic baritone that betrayed absolutely no fear. "My right hand is empty. I am not a threat to you." "Shut up," Nolan snapped, stepping into her personal space. He loomed over her, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her into shrinking. But Renata Vexley had stared down cartel bosses and corrupt senators. A bully in a badge was nothing more than a minor annoyance. "Hey, Nolan," Spencer chimed in, his voice trembling slightly from the passenger side of the cruiser. "Dispatch said the burglary suspect was wearing a red jacket. She's in black." "I know what dispatch said, Spencer. Shut your mouth and secure the perimeter," Nolan barked, not taking his eyes off Renata. "She matches the description enough. Loitering in a high-crime area at midnight. Probably a lookout." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at her face. "Drop the bag and give me your ID. Now." "I am not loitering. I am walking to my residence," Renata replied calmly. "Furthermore, under state law, you do not have the authority to demand my identification without reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed a crime. Being outside at night does not meet that threshold." Nolan's jaw clenched so hard his teeth audibly ground together. A vein throbbed violently at his temple. He despised when they knew the law. He hated the calm, steady rhythm of her voice, the total absence of the fear he fed on. It made him feel small, and Officer Nolan responded to feeling small with extreme, disproportionate violence. "Oh, we got a street scholar here," Nolan sneered, a dark, ugly smile twisting his lips. He lunged forward, grabbing the paper bag from her hand and throwing it onto the wet pavement. The plastic pill bottles rattled loudly. "You think you can quote the law to me? I am the law out here." "You have just illegally seized my property, officer," Renata said, her eyes tracking the paper bag on the ground. She knew the flash drive was buried deep inside, protected by a hard casing, but the sheer audacity of the officer's actions was staggering. She looked back up at Nolan, her gaze piercing. "I highly suggest you step back, regulate your breathing, and think very carefully about your next action." That was the match in the powder barrel. "Don't you ever tell me what to do," Nolan bellowed. He grabbed Renata by the shoulders of her hoodie and spun her violently. He shoved her hard against the rough brick wall of the pharmacy. The impact forced the breath from her lungs in a sharp gasp, the rough brick scraping the skin of her cheek. "Nolan, Jesus," Spencer yelled, taking a step forward, his hands raised in a futile, placating gesture. "She's not resisting, man. Just run her name." "I said, secure the damn perimeter, Spencer, or you're walking back to the precinct." Nolan roared over his shoulder. He pressed his heavy forearm against the back of Renata's neck, pinning her face first against the wall. He kicked her legs apart with the heavy toe of his combat boot, patting her down with aggressive, humiliating roughness. Renata closed her eyes, forcing her heart rate down. She compartmentalized the pain, the humiliation, the sheer, burning rage. Let him hang himself, she thought coldly. Let him commit every violation on the record. Nolan found nothing in her pockets. Furious that his search had yielded no weapons, no drugs, no justification for his brutality, he grabbed the back of her hoodie. In doing so, his thick fingers hooked onto the edge of her emerald green silk bonnet. With a violent yank, he tore it from her head. The bonnet fell away, and Renata's hair tumbled down. It was a magnificent cascade of thick, heavy, perfectly cultivated locks, falling past her shoulders and down to her waist. It was a crown she wore with immense pride, a physical manifestation of her heritage, her patience, and her unyielding identity in a world that constantly demanded she assimilate. Nolan stared at the hair, his lip curling in disgust. To him, it wasn't a crown, it was a symbol of defiance, a visual middle finger to the neat, clipped, subservient order he demanded from the people he policed. "Look at this mess," Nolan muttered, his voice dropping to a sinister, quiet hiss. He grabbed a thick handful of her locks, pulling her head back slightly. "You walk around thinking you're special, thinking your big words and your attitude make you better than me. You think you're untouchable." Renata did not answer. She maintained her icy silence, her eyes fixed on the brick mortar inches from her face. Nolan reached to his tactical belt. He didn't reach for his handcuffs. He unclipped a heavy, battery-powered set of hair clippers. It was an open secret in the precinct. Nolan kept them to humiliate suspected gang members. shaving lines into their eyebrows or patches into their hair to mark them as his property, a brutal warning to the neighborhood. He thumbed the power switch. The mechanical buzzing filled the air, loud and jarring against the quiet hum of the pharmacy's neon sign. Spencer froze, the blood draining from his face. Nolan, no. Come on, man. Put those away. That's battery. That's a federal violation. The captain, Captain Cavendish, turns a blind eye because I get results. Nolan snapped. He pressed the cold steel blades against the top of Renata's scalp. You need to learn respect. You need to learn your place on my streets. Without another word, Nolan shoved the clippers forcefully through her hair. Renata gasped sharply as the metal teeth bit into her scalp. The physical sensation was jarring, the vibration rattling her skull, the brutal tugging as years of growth were violently severed. Thick, heavy ropes of her hair fell past her face, tumbling over her shoulders and hitting the wet pavement with soft, heartbreaking thuds. Nolan didn't stop. Breathing heavily, drunk on his own twisted sense of authority, he dragged the clippers back and forth across the top of her head. He carved a massive, jagged, humiliating path down the center of her scalp, exposing the raw, cold skin beneath. He butchered her crown, turning her pride into a jagged, uneven ruin. When he finally pulled the clippers away, the silence that followed was deafening. The buzzing stopped. Only the sound of Spencer's ragged breathing and the distant wail of a siren filled the void. Nolan stepped back, admiring his handiwork. He kicked a pile of her severed locks with the toe of his boot. There, now you look exactly like what you are. A nobody. He pulled his handcuffs from his belt. Turn around, hands behind your back. You're under arrest for assaulting an officer and resisting. Renata slowly pushed herself off the brick wall. She turned to face him. Her scalp was a jagged ruin, the cold night air biting at the exposed skin. She did not cry. She did not scream. Her face was a mask of such terrifying, absolute composure that for a fraction of a second, a cold shiver of doubt ran down Nolan's spine. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, locked onto his. It was not the look of a victim. It was the look of a judge who had just silently handed down a death sentence. "Are you finished?" Renata asked. Her voice didn't shake. It was terrifyingly calm, carved from absolute ice. "I'm just getting started," Nolan laughed, though the sound was hollow, brittle against the crushing weight of her stare. He lunged forward, roughly grabbing her wrists and clicking the cold steel handcuffs shut. "You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Minuta 1. Renata stood perfectly still, her hands bound behind her back. Officer Nolan, badge number 4492. Officer Spencer, badge number 6108. She recited smoothly, her voice carrying over the hum of the cruiser's engine. "I told you to shut up," Nolan barked, grabbing her by the bicep to drag her toward the back of the cruiser. "I am simply establishing the timeline for the federal investigators," Renata continued, walking at her own measured pace, refusing to be dragged. "In approximately 2 minutes, your reality is going to drastically alter. I suggest you enjoy these final seconds of your perceived authority." Nolan shoved her against the rear door of the cruiser. "You're delusional. You're going to a holding cell, and you're going to rot there until Monday morning." Spencer, pale and sweating profusely, moved to pick up the paper bag Nolan had thrown on the ground. "Nolan, we need to bag this as evidence. She said it was medication." "Leave it," Nolan ordered. "It's probably street trash." "I would strongly advise you to pick up that bag, Officer Spencer," Renata said softly. "Its contents are classified under federal seal." Minuta 2. Nolan let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. "Federal seal? Lady, you are out of your damn mind. Open the door, Spence. Let's get her in the cage." Spencer reached for the door handle, his hand trembling so violently he missed it on the first try. He looked at the severed locks of hair scattered on the concrete, then up to the stoic, ruined crown of the woman before him. His instincts, buried beneath months of toxic precinct culture, were screaming at him that they had made a colossal, terminal mistake. Before Spencer could open the door, a sound ripped through the night, a deep, resonant, vibrating hum that was entirely different from a police siren. It was the synchronized roar of high-performance engines. From the north end of the intersection, a convoy of 4 matte black, armored SUVs tore around the corner. They didn't slow down. They moved in perfect, aggressive tactical formation, swarming the intersection. 2 SUVs jumped the curb, pinning Nolan's cruiser against the pharmacy wall. The other 2 boxed them in from behind. "What the hell?" Nolan shouted, dropping Renata's arm and instinctively reaching for his gun. "Do not touch that weapon." A voice boomed over a heavy PA system. The doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. A dozen men and women in heavy tactical gear, bearing the bright gold letters of the United States Marshal Service, flooded the street. Laser sights cut through the dark, painting Nolan's chest and forehead with a dozen red dots. From the lead SUV stepped a man whose very presence commanded the chaos to halt. It was Rowan, Renata's husband. He was a tall, imposing figure, a former federal prosecutor who now served as the Deputy Attorney General. His face, usually a mask of diplomatic calm, was twisted into a terrifying snarl. Right behind him, pulled from the second SUV, was Captain Theo Cavendish, Nolan's precinct commander. Theo was not in uniform. He was wearing pajama pants and a hastily thrown-on jacket, his face the color of wet ash. The marshals had clearly dragged him from his bed. "Rowan," Renata said quietly, the first hint of warmth entering her voice. Rowan's eyes snapped to his wife. He saw the handcuffs. He saw the ripped hoodie. And then he saw her hair. The jagged, butchered ruin of her locks scattered on the pavement. A sound, something between a growl and a sob, escaped his throat. He stormed forward, ignoring the guns, ignoring Nolan, and gently placed his hands on Renata's shoulders. "Who did this?" Rowan asked, his voice a lethal whisper that promised absolute destruction. Minute 3. Nolan stood paralyzed. The clippers on his belt suddenly felt like a ticking bomb. He looked at the heavily armed federal agents, at the Deputy Attorney General, and then at his own captain, who looked like he was about to vomit. "Captain Cavendish," Nolan stammered, his voice cracking. "Cap, what is this? This woman." She was resisting. She matched a description. Theo Cavendish slowly raised his head. He looked at Nolan with a mixture of pure hatred and bottomless despair. "You incredibly stupid animal," Theo whispered. "Do you have any idea who you just put your hands on?" Nolan swallowed hard, the taste of copper flooding his mouth. She's just some local." "That," Theo said, pointing a trembling finger at the woman in the handcuffs, "is the Honorable Chief Judge Renata Vexley. She oversees the entire federal district court." The world dropped out from beneath Nolan. His ears rang. The streetlights seemed to spin. Chief Judge Vexley, the Iron Guillotine, the woman who had systematically dismantled 3 corrupt police precincts in the last 5 years. He hadn't just assaulted a citizen, he had mutilated the most powerful federal magistrate in the state. "Unlock her. Right now," Rowan commanded, stepping aside to reveal Marshall. Nolan couldn't move. His fingers were numb. Spencer, sobbing quietly, rushed forward, his hand shaking so badly it took him 3 tries to get the key into the cuffs. As the handcuffs fell away, Renata rubbed her wrists, maintaining her unyielding posture. She looked at Theo Cavendish. "Captain, I see my marshals found you promptly. We had a ping on my location when my biometric heart rate monitor spiked 5 minutes ago." "Your Honor," Theo begged, falling to his knees on the wet pavement. "I swear to God, I didn't know he was doing this. I didn't sanction this." "You protected him, Theo, which makes you complicit," Renata said coldly. She turned her gaze to Nolan, whose legs had finally given out. He was sitting on the pavement, staring blankly at her severed hair. "Officer Spencer," Renata said. Spencer jolted to attention, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, ma'am, Your Honor." "Pick up the paper bag," she instructed. Spencer scrambled to grab the bag. "Open it," she commanded. Spencer reached inside, pulling past the pill bottles, and withdrew a sleek, silver, heavy-duty flash drive. It had a small red seal stamped on the side. "Officer Nolan assumed I was carrying contraband." Renata addressed the silent, stunned street. "In reality, I was carrying the master ledger of the O'Bannon crime syndicate, a ledger that explicitly details the bribes paid to Captain Cavendish and the extrajudicial enforcement carried out by Officer Nolan on their behalf." Nolan's eyes widened in sheer horror. She wasn't just a judge. She was the judge presiding over his own secret corruption. I signed the arrest warrants for both of you 2 hours ago, Renata said, her voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. You were going to be arrested quietly at dawn. But you, Nolan, couldn't help yourself. By assaulting a federal judge, using a weapon to mutilate me, and attempting to destroy federal evidence. You have just upgraded a RICO charge into domestic terrorism. She looked down at the shivering, broken bully on the ground. Take them both, Renata ordered the marshals, and make sure they are placed in federal holding. They belong to me now. The United States Metropolitan Detention Center was a monolith of brutalist architecture, a windowless fortress of gray concrete and reinforced steel that swallowed men whole. Unlike the chaotic, urine-scented holding cells of his local precinct where Officer Nolan was treated like a king returning to his castle, the federal facility was a realm of terrifying, clinical silence. Here, there were no brother officers to slip him an extra coffee, no desk sergeants to look the other way, and no Captain Cavendish to sweep his sins under the rug. Nolan sat on the edge of a thin, stiff mattress, his massive frame shivering in a generic, neon-orange jumpsuit. The fabric scratched against his skin, a stark, humiliating contrast to the tailored, intimidating police uniform he had worn just 4 hours ago. His wrists, usually adorned with the heavy silver watch he had taken off a suspect 3 years prior, were raw and bruised from the rigid federal handcuffs. Across the immaculate, heavily monitored cell block, isolated behind thick, bullet-resistant plexiglass, sat Theo Cavendish. The former precinct captain looked as though he had aged 20 years in a single night. He was huddled in the corner of his cell, his knees pulled to his chest, rocking slightly. Cavendish knew exactly what happened to corrupt cops in federal prison, especially those tied to the O'Bannon crime syndicate. Nolan's mind was a violent hurricane of denial and sheer, paralyzing terror. He kept touching the empty space on his belt where his clippers usually hung. He replayed the moment 1,000 times, the feeling of the hair giving way, the cold look in her eyes, the sudden arrival of the marshals. Chief Judge Renata Vexley. The name echoed in his skull like a death knell. He had mutilated the most powerful judge in the district over a bruised ego. The heavy, mechanized hum of the cell block door sliding open broke the silence. The sound of hard-soled shoes clicking against the polished concrete floor echoed methodically. It wasn't the heavy, rushed stomp of a guard. It was the measured, deliberate pace of an apex predator inspecting a trap. Rowan Vexley, the Deputy Attorney General of the United States, stopped in front of Nolan's cell. He had changed out of his damp overcoat and now wore an immaculately tailored midnight blue suit. His posture was perfectly rigid, his face an impenetrable mask of cold, legal wrath. He did not look angry, he looked absolute. Stand up when the Deputy Attorney General graces your cell, inmate, a towering federal guard barked, slamming a heavy baton against the plexiglass. Nolan flinched, his instincts screaming at him to fight back, to assert dominance. But as he looked into Rowan's eyes, the alpha male bravado drained completely out of him. He slowly stood up, his legs trembling slightly. Mr. Vexley, listen to me. I didn't. You will speak only when spoken to, Nolan, Rowan interrupted, his voice a low, smooth baritone that somehow carried more threat than a shout. I am not here to interrogate you. Your confession is irrelevant. We have the body cam footage from Spencer's cruiser, which my marshals seized from Cavendish's vehicle before he could destroy it. We have the audio from my wife's wire. We have the master ledger of the O'Bannon Syndicate. Nolan swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. Then why are you here? I am here to explain the exact parameters of your new reality, Rowan said, taking a slow step closer to the glass. You operated under the delusion that your badge made you a wolf among sheep. But you were never a wolf, Nolan. You were a rabid dog, kept on a very short leash by Captain Cavendish, who was, in turn, kept on a leash by the O'Bannon family. You were muscle, disposable. Rowan reached into his breast pocket and produced a single, high-resolution photograph. He pressed it against the glass so Nolan could see it. It was a surveillance image of an older man with silver hair, sipping espresso at an outdoor cafe. Declan O'Bannon, Rowan stated. 2 hours ago, federal agents raided 6 of his properties. We froze $30 million in offshore assets. We seized his ports, his warehouses, and his primary distribution hubs. The entire syndicate is currently bleeding to death. And do you know why, Nolan? Nolan couldn't speak. He shook his head, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Because of the ledger you so graciously recovered from my wife's hand, Rowan smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. You see, we knew Breyer, the court clerk, had procured the drive. We also knew that O'Bannon had a mole in the courthouse who alerted him to the handoff. We knew O'Bannon ordered a hit squad to intercept my wife before she could get the drive to a secure federal vault. We needed to protect her, but we also needed O'Bannon's men to make a move to justify the immediate, warrantless raids. A sickening realization began to curdle in Nolan's stomach. We anticipated armed mercenaries, Rowan continued softly. We had marshals shadowing her from a block away, ready to intercept a professional hit. What we did not anticipate was that the first people to attack my wife in the dark would be two uniformed police officers acting entirely on their own bigoted, power-hungry impulses. Rowan leaned closer to the glass. You ruined a meticulously planned federal operation because you couldn't control your own vile nature. You assaulted the chief judge. You mutilated her. And in doing so, you became the catalyst for the downfall of the largest crime family on the East Coast. Nolan stumbled back, his legs hitting the edge of the mattress. He collapsed onto it. O'Bannon. O'Bannon is going to think I flipped. He's going to think Cavendish and I orchestrated this to save ourselves. He already does, Rowan confirmed coldly. Which is why I suggest you look very closely at the guards who bring your meals. I suggest you sleep with one eye open. You are no longer a cop, Nolan. You are a loose end. A very vulnerable, highly despised loose end. Rowan turned away, his expensive shoes pivoting on the concrete. He paused and looked back over his shoulder. My wife is an instrument of the law, Nolan. She believes in the absolute sanctity of the courts. She will ensure you receive a fair trial before she locks you in a cage for the rest of your natural life. I, however, am a pragmatist. I hope the syndicate gets to you first. As Rowan walked away, leaving Nolan drowning in a sea of his own making, a federal guard walked past the cell. The guard didn't look at Nolan. He simply dragged his baton along the bottom of the meal slot, and a sharp, metallic clink echoed in the small room. Nolan looked down. Resting on the floor just inside his cell was a crudely sharpened toothbrush handle a shank. Attached to it was a tiny, crumpled piece of paper. Nolan picked it up with shaking hands. The note read, "For the rat. Do it yourself, or we'll make it hurt." The morning light filtered through the towering, stained glass windows of Federal Courtroom 302, casting long, fractured shadows across the rich mahogany benches. The gallery was packed to capacity, a tense, whispering sea of journalists, federal agents, and high-ranking city officials. The air was thick with anticipation. The news of Captain Cavendish's and Officer Nolan's arrests had leaked before dawn, sending shockwaves through the entire state. The charges RICO violations, extortion, assault on a federal judge, and deprivation of rights under color of law were explosive. But the whispers in the gallery weren't just about the charges. They were about the rumor of what Nolan had done to her. In her private chambers, Renata Vexley stood before a full-length mirror. The emerald silk gala dress was gone, replaced by the heavy, austere black robes of her office. The robe felt different today. It felt like armor. Monica, her lead security agent, stood by the door, her eyes tight with a mixture of sorrow and burning anger. "Your Honor, the press pool is out of control. We can clear the gallery if you prefer a closed arraignment. We can also provide a head covering, a wrap, anything you need." Renata stared at her reflection. The jagged, butchered path Nolan had carved down the center of her scalp was a horrifying wound against her otherwise regal composure. It was an intentional branding, a violent attempt to strip away her dignity and her identity. For a moment, she closed her eyes, remembering the humiliating buzz of the clippers, the rain, the sheer hatred in the officer's eyes. "No, Monica," Renata said, her voice steady, resonating with a profound, unyielding strength. "If I cover it, I validate his belief that he took something vital from me. He took hair. He did not take my power." Rowan stepped out of the private adjoining bathroom. In his hand, He held a straight razor and a warm, damp towel. His eyes met his wife's in the mirror. There was an unspoken conversation between them, a silent vow of mutual resilience. "Sit down, my love," Rowan said softly. Renata sat in the leather chair. Rowan draped the warm towel over her scalp, letting the heat soothe the raw, scraped skin. Then, with meticulous, loving precision, he applied shaving cream and began to work. He didn't try to salvage the remaining locks. He sheared them all away, dragging the sharp blade smoothly across her scalp until every jagged remnant of Nolan's assault was gone. He shaved her head completely bare. When he finished, he wiped away the excess foam. Renata looked in the mirror again. Her striking facial features, the sharp cheekbones, the piercing, intelligent dark eyes, the proud line of her jaw were now entirely unobstructed. The baldness did not make her look victimized. Combined with the heavy black robes, it made her look terrifying. She looked like an executioner. She looked like the iron guillotine. "It's time," Renata said, standing up. "Give them hell," Rowan whispered, kissing her forehead. The bailiff's voice echoed through the massive courtroom. "All rise. The United States District Court is now in session. The Honorable Chief Judge Renata Vexley presiding. God save the United States and this honorable court." The heavy oak doors behind the bench swung open. Renata walked out. A collective, audible gasp ripped through the gallery. The flashing of cameras from the designated press box went into a frenzied overdrive. Reporters scribbled furiously. The visual shock of the chief judge, known for her magnificent crown of locks, appearing completely, flawlessly bald, was a gut punch to everyone in the room. It was a visceral, undeniable testament to the violence she had endured mere hours ago. Renata did not acknowledge the gasps. She ascended the steps, her posture rigid, and took her seat at the elevated bench. She looked down at the prosecution tables, then at the defense. "Be seated," she commanded. The noise in the room instantly vanished, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. The side doors opened, and the U.S. Marshals led the defendants into the room. Nolan and Cavendish were shackled at the wrists and ankles, their bright orange jumpsuits glowing like hazard signs in the somber room. Nolan's eyes immediately darted to the bench. When he saw Renata, stripped of her hair but radiating an aura of absolute destruction, his knees buckled slightly. A marshal had to grip his arm to keep him standing. Cavendish looked at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with the woman whose life he had helped shatter. "We are here for the arraignment of Theodore Cavendish and Marcus Nolan," Renata began, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "The charges include racketeering, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, extortion, and aggravated assault on a federal officer. The government is represented by Special Prosecutor Vance. The defense is—" She looked at the empty chairs next to the defendants. "Unrepresented?" "Your Honor," Cavendish croaked, his voice pathetic. "My attorney, Mr. Sterling. He was supposed to be here." Special Prosecutor Vance, a bulldog of a lawyer handpicked by Rowan, stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Sterling filed a motion to withdraw from this case exactly 12 minutes ago. It appears that since the freezing of the O'Bannon Syndicate's assets at dawn, Mr. Cavendish is no longer able to afford his retainer." A ripple of low murmurs swept the gallery. Cavendish's mob protection had abandoned him the moment the money dried up. "I see," Renata said coldly. "A public defender will be appointed. How does the government plead regarding bail?" "The government requests remand without bail, Your Honor," Vance stated firmly. "Both men represent a severe flight risk and a danger to the community. Furthermore, we have a newly sworn, cooperating federal witness who can testify to the extreme lengths these defendants will go to suppress evidence." Nolan's head snapped up. Cooperating witness? O'Bannon hadn't been arrested yet. Who was flipping? The rear doors of the courtroom opened. Walking down the center aisle, flanked by two heavily armed marshals, was a man in a sharp gray suit. He looked clean-cut, composed, and entirely different from the terrified, stuttering rookie in the alleyway. It was Officer Spencer. Nolan's jaw dropped. "Spencer, you rat, you piece of—" "Silence the defendant, witnesses," Renata ordered sharply. A marshal shoved Nolan roughly into his chair. Spencer took a seat behind the prosecutor's table. He looked directly at Nolan, his eyes devoid of the hero worship and fear that Nolan had previously thrived on. Officer Spencer is not just a cooperating witness. Your Honor, Vance announced to the stunned courtroom. Special Agent David Spencer has been operating deep undercover for the FBI's Internal Public Corruption Task Force for the past 14 months. The revelation hit the courtroom like a seismic charge. Nolan slumped in his chair, his mind short-circuiting. The rookie he had bullied, the kid he thought he was molding into a real street cop, was a federal agent. Every bribe Nolan had taken, every suspect he had beaten in an alley, every piece of evidence he had planted while Spencer watched nervously, it had all been documented. It had all been an operation. Agent Spencer was placed in the 4th Precinct specifically to gather actionable intelligence on Captain Cavendish's connections to the O'Bannon family, Prosecutor Vance continued, holding up a thick binder. For over a year, Agent Spencer built a watertight case. However, the final piece of the puzzle, the physical ledger connecting the cash flow to the captain, remained elusive until last night. Nolan's eyes darted frantically around the room, the walls of his reality entirely collapsing. He looked at Renata, sitting high above him, her bald head catching the light, an unreadable, stony expression on her face. "You set me up," Nolan whispered, the sheer horror of the manipulation dawning on him. He looked at Agent Spencer, then up to the judge. You knew. "Address the court properly, Mr. Nolan, or you will be removed," Renata warned, her voice devoid of emotion. Agent Spencer was wearing a Class A federal wire during the incident at the pharmacy, Your Honor, Vance stated, pressing the advantage. He deliberately allowed defendant Nolan to escalate the confrontation. While Agent Spencer could not have predicted the specific, horrific nature of the assault on Your Honor, his objective was to capture defendant Nolan committing a felony violation of civil rights on camera, thereby establishing probable cause for an immediate, on-site arrest and the subsequent raid of the precinct. Nolan felt a cold, acidic bile rise in his throat. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had walked blindly into a meticulously designed federal trap. He was a pawn. They had used his own racism, his own unchecked aggression, to hang him. The entire encounter in the alley, the confident way she spoke, the lack of fear, she knew the cavalry was listening. She knew he was destroying his own life with every second the clippers buzzed. Based on the overwhelming evidence, the government's motion to deny bail is granted. Renata struck her gavel, the crack echoing like a gunshot. The defendants are remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals Service, pending trial. Furthermore, given the highly sensitive nature of the evidence and the defendants' ties to organized crime, they will be placed in solitary confinement under 2 4-hour surveillance. "No!" Cavendish screamed, suddenly lunging toward the bench, restrained instantly by 3 marshals. "Your Honor, please. Solitary? O'Bannon has guards on his payroll in the MDC. They'll kill us. You're signing our death warrants." Renata looked down at the former captain. Her dark eyes were bottomless pits of judicial fury. "You spent a decade turning a blind eye while officers like Mr. Nolan terrorized the citizens you swore to protect. You created a kingdom built on brutality and silence. You will now experience the exact environment you fostered. Take them out." As the marshals dragged the screaming Cavendish and the catatonic Nolan toward the side doors, a sudden, violent commotion erupted in the gallery. A man seated in the 3rd row, wearing a heavy coat despite the summer heat, suddenly stood up. He bypassed the metal detectors. He was an insider. It was a court bailiff, a veteran officer who had worked the halls for years. He reached beneath his uniform jacket, his face twisted in a desperate, frantic grimace. He wasn't aiming for the defendants. He was aiming for the bench. "For O'Bannon." The corrupted bailiff screamed, pulling a black, suppressed 9mm handgun. The crime syndicate, seeing their empire crumbling, was enacting a scorched earth protocol. If they were going down, they were taking the iron guillotine with them. Chaos exploded. Civilians screamed and dropped to the floor. Reporters scrambled over benches. But Renata did not duck. She did not flinch. She sat perfectly still, her eyes locked on the gunman. Before the corrupt bailiff could even raise the barrel of the weapon, a blindingly fast shadow moved from the side of the courtroom. It was Monica, Renata's lead security agent. She didn't shout a warning. She drew her service weapon and fired twice in a fraction of a second. Crack, crack. Both rounds struck the corrupted bailiff squarely in the chest. He collapsed backward over the wooden pews, his gun clattering uselessly to the floor. Simultaneously, the rear doors of the courtroom burst open, and a dozen FBI tactical agents flooded the room, their weapons raised, securing the perimeter in seconds. Rowan Vexley strode into the room right behind them, his eyes immediately finding his wife on the bench. Seeing her unharmed, the rigid tension in his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. The courtroom was in total bedlam, filled with the smell of gunpowder and the panicked cries of the gallery. But at the center of the storm, Chief Judge Renata Vexley remained a pillar of absolute, terrifying calm. She picked up her gavel and struck it against the sounding block, the sharp sound cutting through the chaos. "Order," she commanded, her voice amplified by the microphone, steady and unshaken. "Order in this court." Nolan, who had been thrown to the ground by the marshals during the gunfire, looked up at the bench from his stomach. He saw the dead assassin, he saw the tactical teams, and he saw Renata, staring down at him with eyes that promised hell. In that moment, lying on the floor of the federal courthouse, stripped of his hair, his badge, and his freedom, Officer Nolan finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of his error. He hadn't just picked a fight with a citizen in an alley. He had triggered an avalanche that was burying the entire corrupt underworld of the city, and he was trapped right at the bottom. Solitary confinement in the Metropolitan Detention Center was a sensory void designed to break the human mind. The cell was a 6 by 8 foot concrete box illuminated by a single, recessed fluorescent bulb that hummed with a maddening, relentless frequency. There were no windows, no sense of day or night, only the suffocating weight of absolute isolation. Officer Nolan had been in the hole for 72 hours following the assassination attempt in the courtroom. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blinding muzzle flashes of Monica's gun, the dead bailiff collapsing, and the unyielding, terrifying stare of Chief Judge Renata Vexley. He was a man suspended over a bottomless abyss, waiting for the rope to snap. The heavy steel door of his cell clanged loudly, the multiple deadbolts sliding back with a deafening metallic screech. Nolan scrambled backward until his spine hit the cold concrete wall. He expected the worst to hit squad disguised as federal guards, coming to finish the job the bailiff started. Instead, a single guard stepped into the cell. It was a woman with cold, dead eyes and a jaw tightly clenched around a piece of chewing gum. Her name tag read Daphne. Nolan recognized her type instantly. He had worked alongside corrupt guards like Daphne for years. She was a mercenary in a uniform, loyal to nothing but the highest bidder. "You got a visitor, Nolan," Daphne said, her voice a flat, mechanical drone. "Off the books. You breathe a word of this, and I'll make sure your meals come laced with crushed glass for the rest of your short life." Daphne stepped aside. Walking into the suffocatingly small cell was a woman who looked entirely out of place in a federal penitentiary. She wore a tailored crimson blazer, a sharp black pencil skirt, and impossibly high Louboutin heels that clicked ominously on the concrete. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, immaculate bun. This was Celeste. Celeste was the apex predator of the legal underworld. She was the O'Bannon Syndicate's primary fixer, a ruthless defense attorney who specialized in burying witnesses, bribing juries, and silencing loose ends. "Officer Nolan," Celeste purred, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from her pocket to wipe a microscopic speck of dust from the cell's steel stool before sitting down. "You look significantly worse than your precinct photo." Nolan's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You're O'Bannon's lawyer. Did he send you? Look, tell him I didn't flip. Spencer was a Fed. He wore a wire. I didn't say a word about the ledger or the shipments." "Calm yourself, Marcus. The panic is unbecoming," Celeste said, crossing her legs. Her icy blue eyes evaluated him with the clinical detachment of a butcher examining a side of beef. "Declan O'Bannon knows exactly what happened. He knows about the wire. He knows about Agent Spencer. And he knows that your infantile, racist temper tantrum in that alleyway gave Chief Judge Vexley the exact legal leverage she needed to sign the RICO warrants. It was a mistake," Nolan pleaded, his voice cracking. The tough guy facade was completely obliterated. I was trying to maintain order. She wouldn't respect my authority." "Your authority?" Celeste laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that offered no comfort. You never had authority. You were a blunt instrument we paid to look the other way. And now, that instrument has struck the hornet's nest. The federal government has seized 60% of our operations. Declan is currently fighting extradition from a non-extradition country because Rowan Vexley pulled geopolitical strings just to watch him squirm. Nolan swallowed hard. What do you want from me? Why are you here? I am here to inform you of the narrative, Celeste said smoothly, leaning forward. Captain Cavendish was found dead in his cell an hour ago. Nolan stopped breathing. The blood rushed from his face, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. Dead, but he was in solitary, like me. He fashioned a noose from his jumpsuit, a tragic suicide brought on by the immense guilt of his crimes. Celeste lied flawlessly, her eyes locking onto Nolan's with lethal intent. At least, that is what the coroner's report will say. Daphne here was on duty. She sadly missed the incident during her rounds. Daphne chewed her gum, her expression entirely blank. Cavendish is gone, Celeste continued, which means all the Syndicate's bribes, all the coordinated hits, all the precinct corruption, it all needs a mastermind. A fall guy who acted entirely on his own. No, Nolan whispered, shaking his head frantically. No, you can't pin it all on me. I was just a patrolman. The judge knows I wasn't the boss. The feds want convictions, Marcus, Celeste countered coldly. We have fabricated digital trails linking offshore accounts directly to your ex-wife's name. We have found a stash of unregistered weapons in a storage unit registered to your brother. If you attempt to drag the O'Bannon name any further into the mud, your family will suffer catastrophic consequences. If you plead guilty to every charge, state that Cavendish was your subordinate in the extortion ring, and take the life sentence quietly. Your family lives. You're framing me for the whole empire, Nolan gasped, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. We are cleaning up your mess, Celeste corrected, standing up and smoothing her skirt. You have your instructions. Daphne will ensure you remain compliant until the trial. Without another word, Celeste walked out of the cell. Daphne followed, the heavy steel door slamming shut, locking Nolan in the terrifying, deafening silence with the absolute certainty that his life was over. 6 months later, the atmosphere in Federal Courtroom 302 was electric. The high-profile trial of the century had reached its final day. Officer Marcus Nolan sat at the defense table. He was a shell of the man he once was. He had lost 40 pounds, his once bulging muscles replaced by gaunt, shivering tension. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken and darting nervously around the room. He had survived solitary confinement and multiple attempts on his life orchestrated by Daphne, only to be dragged into the merciless spotlight of the federal court. Seated directly across the room at the prosecution table was Special Prosecutor Vance, looking incredibly smug. Next to him was Rowan Vexley, observing the proceedings with the calm, predatory satisfaction of a grandmaster 3 moves away from checkmate. And sitting high above them all, an avatar of unyielding justice, was Chief Judge Renata Vexley. Her hair had begun to grow back, forming a tight, elegant, powerful crop that framed her sharp features. She wore her black robes not just as a uniform, but as a mantle of absolute authority. Beside her, managing the court documents with rapid efficiency, was her trusted clerk, Breyer, the very woman who had smuggled the damning flash drive out of the courthouse 6 months ago. Standing guard by the judge's chamber's door was Monica, her eyes scanning the room for threats, her hand resting casually near her service weapon. Mr. Nolan, Judge Vexley's voice resonated through the silent courtroom. It was the same calm, icy tone that had haunted his nightmares since the alleyway. You have changed your plea from not guilty to guilty on all 74 counts, including racketeering, conspiracy, and domestic terrorism. Are you making this plea voluntarily? Nolan stood up, his legs shaking. He looked at the back row of the gallery. Celeste was sitting there, her eyes locked onto him, a silent, deadly reminder of the threat against his family. He swallowed the bitter taste of utter defeat. Yes, Your Honor, Nolan croaked, his voice barely audible. I acted alone. Captain Cavendish followed my orders. The Syndicate, I ran the precinct side of it. A murmur rippled through the gallery. It was an obvious lie. a desperate man reading from a cartel-approved script. Renata leaned forward, resting her hands on the heavy mahogany bench. Mr. Nolan, do you genuinely believe this court is foolish enough to accept this manufactured narrative? Nolan froze. Celeste's eyes narrowed. Your Honor, the defendant has pled guilty. Nolan's exhausted public defender interjected weakly. I am aware of the plea, Counselor, Renata replied sharply. She looked back down at Nolan. You are attempting to fall on your sword to protect Declan O'Bannon. You believe that, by taking the blame for Captain Cavendish's crimes, you will secure the safety of your hidden assets and your family. Is that correct? Nolan's heart stopped. Hidden assets? Rowan stood up from the prosecution table, buttoning his suit jacket. With the court's permission, the government would like to submit a new piece of evidence into the sentencing record. Proceed, Renata commanded. Breyer, the clerk, handed a thick manila folder down to the defense table. Nolan opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of a false wall in a basement, stacks of $100 bills, and a dozen gold bars. It was the nest egg Nolan had stolen from crime scenes over the past 10 years, his absolute last resort, a secret he thought no one in the world knew about. Federal agents, led by Deputy Attorney General Vexley's task force, raided that property at dawn. Special Prosecutor Vance announced to the court, the assets have been seized under federal civil forfeiture laws. Furthermore, we have intercepted encrypted communications between Celeste Vance, attorney for the O'Bannon family, and a corrupt prison guard named Daphne, proving extortion and witness tampering against the defendant. In the back of the room, Celeste stood up sharply, realizing the trap had just snapped shut on her as well. Before she could reach the aisle, 2 U.S. Marshals stepped in front of her, handcuffs already drawn. You have nothing left to trade, Mr. Nolan, Renata said, her voice dropping to a terrifying absolute register. The O'Bannon Syndicate has been dismantled. Declan O'Bannon was arrested in Geneva 3 days ago. Your lawyer is under arrest. Your corrupt guard, Daphne, has flipped and signed a full confession, and your stolen wealth has been reclaimed by the state. Nolan collapsed into his chair. He was stripped bare. Every lie, every backup plan, every ounce of false power he possessed had been systematically, brutally dismantled by the woman he had assaulted. You have no syndicate to protect you. You have no badge to hide behind, Renata stated, her eyes burning with the weight of absolute justice. You are standing exactly where you put so many innocent people, utterly helpless and entirely at the mercy of the law. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the scratch of the court reporter's stenograph machine. It was time for the sentencing. Nolan was forced to stand. He couldn't look at Renata. He kept his eyes fixed on the wooden grain of the defense table, his mind completely broken. Marcus Nolan, Chief Judge Vexley began, her voice echoing with historical weight. When you put on that uniform, you were entrusted with the sacred duty of protecting the public. Instead, you weaponized your badge. You preyed upon the vulnerable, the marginalized, and the poor. You used your authority to mask your deep-seated cowardice and your vile prejudices. Nolan wept silently, the tears falling onto the table. You believe that because I am a black woman, because I dared to stand in your presence with dignity, I was somehow beneath you, Renata continued, her voice rising, filling every corner of the massive room. You sought to humiliate me. You sought to brand me. You took clippers to my head because you thought stripping me of my hair would strip me of my power. Renata paused. She looked at Rowan, who gave her a single, proud nod. She looked at Breyer, who was beaming with fierce loyalty. She looked at Monica, standing tall and vigilant. But you fundamentally misunderstood what power is, Renata said, bringing her gaze back to crush Nolan. Power is not a gun. Power is not a badge used as a cudgel. Power is the absolute, unyielding adherence to the law, and the law has caught up with you. Nolan looked up, his face a mask of total devastation. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. Your apologies are as empty as your authority, Renata said coldly. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. For the crimes of racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, and the aggravated assault of a federal judge, I sentence you, Marcus Nolan, to 2 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the possibility of parole. Nolan's knees gave out. He collapsed completely, howling in despair as the marshals grabbed him under his arms to drag him back to his feet. Furthermore, Renata added, her voice cutting through his screams, I am ordering that you serve your sentence in the general population of the United States Penitentiary, Florence High. You will spend the rest of your natural life among the very men you falsely imprisoned and brutalized. It was the ultimate, inescapable karma. He was going to a place where his badge meant nothing and his history meant everything. Crack. The gavel struck the block. The sound was deafening, the final nail in the coffin of Marcus Nolan's life. Court is adjourned, Renata declared. As the screaming, sobbing former officer was dragged out of the courtroom through the side doors, Renata stood up. She unclasped her heavy black robe, letting it drape over her arm. The gallery remained silent, watching in awe as she descended the steps of the bench. Rowan met her at the bottom. He didn't say a word. He simply offered her his hand. Renata took it. With her head held high, her short crop of hair a symbol of her unbreakable resilience, Chief Presiding Judge Renata Vexley walked out of the courtroom, leaving the ruins of a corrupt empire in her wake. The iron guillotine had fallen, and justice was finally served. Wow, what an incredibly intense, pulse-pounding journey. This story is a powerful reminder that true power doesn't come from a badge, intimidation, or hatred. It comes from resilience, intelligence, and an unyielding commitment to justice. Officer Nolan thought his prejudice and physical force made him untouchable, but he learned the hard way that when you abuse your authority to strip away someone else's dignity, karma will come back to strip away your entire life. Judge Renata Vexley proved that true kings and queens don't need hair to wear a crown. Their strength comes from within. The iron guillotine never misses. If this story of absolute, hard-hitting justice and satisfying karma kept you on the edge of your seat, please smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another dramatic, twist-filled story. Let me know in the comments below, what was the most satisfying moment of karma for you? See you in the next one.